In this episode, we are going to connect security management to a part of organizational life that often decides whether security succeeds quietly or fails loudly. Service management agreements, and how to evaluate them for risk, cost, and accountability. Beginners often hear the word agreement and imagine a legal document that procurement handles, but service management agreements shape real security outcomes because they define what a service provider will do, how performance will be measured, who is responsible for what, and what happens when things go wrong. These agreements can apply to internal service relationships, like when a central technology group provides services to business units, and they can apply to external providers, like managed services or cloud providers. The security impact is not limited to confidentiality. Agreements affect availability expectations, response responsibilities, reporting timelines, and how quickly problems can be fixed. If agreements are unclear, organizations end up arguing during incidents about who owns the work and who pays for remediation, and those arguments delay recovery. If agreements are too strict or unrealistic, costs rise and teams find workarounds. Evaluating agreements is therefore a management skill that protects both the organization and the security program, because it turns vague expectations into accountable obligations that can be enforced and audited. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful starting point is to understand what service management agreements are trying to accomplish at a high level, because that purpose guides how you evaluate them. A service management agreement defines the service being provided, the expected level of performance, the responsibilities of the provider and the customer, and the mechanisms for communication, escalation, and reporting. In many environments, these agreements are expressed as service-level agreements, SLA, which describe measurable commitments like availability, support response time, and maintenance windows. They may also include operational-level agreements, OLA, which define commitments between internal teams to support the SLA outcomes. Beginners sometimes assume these are purely operational documents, but they are also security and risk documents because they define what reliability is promised and what evidence exists to demonstrate it. If a service is critical to mission, the availability commitments and recovery commitments become direct security requirements because availability is part of protecting operations. If a service handles sensitive data, confidentiality and integrity commitments become security requirements because mishandling or unauthorized access can cause harm. Evaluating agreements means asking whether the commitments match the organization's risk tolerance and whether the responsibilities are assigned clearly enough that security outcomes are manageable. When evaluating agreements for risk, you are essentially asking what could go wrong and whether the agreement anticipates those failures in a way that protects the organization. Risk in this context includes service outages, data exposure, unauthorized access, poor change practices, inadequate monitoring, and slow incident response. A strong agreement does not pretend failures will never happen. It defines how failures are handled and what the provider must do when they occur. For example, you should look for clarity about incident notification expectations, escalation paths, and coordination responsibilities. If the provider detects an incident affecting your data or service, the agreement should specify how quickly you will be notified and what information you will receive. You should also look for clarity about how vulnerabilities are managed, how patches are applied, and how changes are approved and communicated, because uncontrolled changes can cause outages and introduce security gaps. Beginners sometimes focus only on the promised uptime number, but risk also lives in the details of process, transparency, and response. A high uptime promise is less meaningful if there is no accountability for how the provider manages risk behind the scenes. Risk evaluation is therefore both about metrics and about operational discipline. Cost evaluation is inseparable from risk evaluation because agreements often trade cost for stronger commitments, and security management involves choosing appropriate trade-offs. Higher availability commitments, faster response times, stronger reporting, and more rigorous security controls usually increase cost, either directly through service fees or indirectly through required staffing and coordination. Beginners sometimes think that choosing the strongest commitments is always best, but the strongest commitments may not be necessary for every service, and excessive commitments can create a budget burden that reduces investment elsewhere. A mature evaluation asks which services are critical enough to justify high-cost commitments and which services can accept lower commitments without unacceptable impact. For example, a customer-facing service might require strong availability and rapid incident response because downtime harms trust and revenue, while a non-critical internal service might tolerate longer recovery times. Cost evaluation also includes understanding what costs are predictable versus surprise costs. Some agreements have base fees but charge extra for certain support activities, emergency response, or additional reporting. If those cost triggers are unclear, an incident can become financially painful in addition to operationally painful. Evaluating cost means making sure the organization understands what it is paying for and what it may pay for later under stress. Accountability is the third pillar, and it is often the most important because unclear accountability creates delays and conflict when the organization most needs speed. Accountability in a service agreement means that responsibilities are assigned clearly, decision authority is defined, and the consequences of failure are understood. You want clarity about who owns security controls within the service, who owns access management decisions, who owns logging and monitoring, and who owns incident response steps. You also want clarity about what the customer must do, because agreements often assume the customer will perform certain tasks such as approving access, providing configuration information, or responding to provider requests. Beginners sometimes assume the provider is responsible for everything, but many services require shared responsibility. If the agreement does not define the boundary, both sides can assume the other side is handling a control, and that gap becomes a risk sink. Accountability also includes how performance is measured and reported, because measurement is the evidence that commitments are being met. If a provider promises a response time but does not provide reporting, the customer cannot verify performance. Clear accountability is what makes the agreement enforceable rather than aspirational. A practical way to evaluate accountability is to look for explicit descriptions of roles and escalation paths, because incidents and failures reveal whether accountability is real. A good agreement describes how incidents are reported, who is contacted, how quickly escalation happens, and what happens if initial response is inadequate. It also describes what constitutes a severity level and what each severity level triggers, so that response is predictable rather than negotiated in the moment. Beginners might think this is operational detail, but it is a security management necessity because rapid response reduces impact. Accountability also includes decision rights, such as who can authorize emergency changes, who can isolate a service, and who can shut down access. If these decision rights are unclear, containment actions may be delayed while teams argue. Another important accountability area is evidence and audit support. If the organization must demonstrate compliance, the provider may need to provide certain evidence, and the agreement should define what evidence is available and how it is delivered. Without that definition, audits become difficult and trust erodes. Accountability is therefore about who does what, who decides what, and how we know it happened. It is also important to evaluate agreements for alignment with internal policies and external obligations, because agreements do not exist in isolation. If the organization has a policy requiring certain protection for sensitive data, the service agreement must support that protection. If external obligations require incident notification within specific timelines, the agreement must ensure the provider can meet those timelines, because the organization may remain responsible even if a provider is involved. Beginners sometimes think contracts shift responsibility, but obligations often remain with the organization, which makes agreement alignment critical. Alignment also matters for data handling expectations, such as whether the provider can use subcontractors, where data can be stored, and how data is retained and disposed. These details can create compliance and security risk if they conflict with internal requirements. A mature evaluation checks these points deliberately rather than assuming procurement handled them. Security leaders often collaborate with legal and procurement partners to ensure alignment, but security must understand what to look for. When agreements align with policy and obligations, the organization reduces surprise risk and gains confidence in its service ecosystem. Another area that affects risk, cost, and accountability is performance measurement, because performance commitments are only meaningful if they can be tracked. Agreements often include metrics for availability, response time, and resolution time, but the organization must understand how those metrics are calculated. For example, what counts as downtime, what counts as a response, and what counts as resolution. If measurement methods are vague, disputes can arise, and disputes weaken enforcement. Measurement also affects cost, because some agreements charge more for higher performance tiers. If the organization is paying for a high tier, it should be able to verify it is receiving it. Measurement affects accountability because reporting is what makes commitments visible. Beginners might assume that reporting is automatically provided, but agreements vary widely, and reporting frequency and detail should be evaluated. It is also important to look for commitments around communication during incidents, because silence during an outage is a serious operational risk. Clear communication expectations reduce confusion and improve coordination, which reduces downtime and reduces impact. In security management, communication is a control because it affects response effectiveness. Finally, evaluating service management agreements is not a one-time activity performed at contract signing. It is part of ongoing governance. Services evolve, providers change processes, and organizational needs change, and agreements may need review and updates to remain fit for purpose. A mature approach includes periodic review of provider performance, incident history, and risk changes, using that information to adjust expectations and costs. If a service becomes more critical, the organization may need stronger commitments. If a service becomes less critical, the organization may be able to reduce cost by choosing a lower tier. Ongoing evaluation also helps detect when accountability is drifting, such as when provider contacts change and escalation paths become outdated. Beginners sometimes assume agreements are static and therefore not their concern after signing, but security management treats agreements as living controls that must be maintained. Maintenance is also a learning process, because performance trends reveal where the provider is strong and where risk is growing. When the organization reviews agreements with evidence, it can make better decisions and avoid being surprised by failures. In conclusion, evaluating service management agreements for risk, cost, and accountability is about ensuring that service relationships support the organization's security and operational goals rather than creating hidden exposure. Risk evaluation focuses on how the agreement anticipates failures, defines incident and change responsibilities, and ensures transparency through reporting and escalation. Cost evaluation focuses on understanding trade-offs, avoiding surprise fees, and aligning service tiers with criticality so resources are spent where they matter most. Accountability evaluation focuses on clear role boundaries, decision rights, escalation paths, and evidence support so commitments can be verified and enforced. Alignment with internal policies and external obligations ensures the organization can meet its responsibilities even when services are provided by others. Ongoing review keeps agreements current as services and risks evolve, turning contracts into managed controls rather than forgotten paperwork. When service management agreements are evaluated with this discipline, the organization gains predictable service performance, clearer responsibility during incidents, and a security posture that holds up under pressure without wasting resources on commitments that do not match real needs.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.